What's up, everybody? Today we're talking about risk in real estate. There's three areas I want to talk about to understand risk, how to not avoid, not get rid of, but manage risk. And that's going to be an important topic through this video. But before we get in, like and subscribe, guys. That helps me out. It tells me you like the content. Comment in the bottom. We use your comments to make other videos. We want this to be engaging as well as educational. With that said, let's talk about risk in real estate. Three things that I really want to focus on, and I'm going to dive into each. First, when you're dealing with real estate, we have three different types of risks that are all equally important, and you need to understand them, and then we can diagnose, so to speak, and figure out how to manage this risk. The first one is capital risk. Okay, capital risk is the money that you put into the real estate deal. That's the down payment, that's investors or you, that's your actual capital put in. The next risk, risk number two, is debt. That is the money the bank or a lender gives you on the real estate that you now owe and have to pay back. The third is liability. Liability within the asset, things that could go wrong, getting sued, those things that involve in an actual physical asset. There are different types of risk and they cover different things, but they're all very important. Let's talk about number one, capital risk. This is what I consider the assumed risk of doing business, right? This is the known risk. There's something that you need to be aware of, and that's called risk of ruin. That is the risk we are trying to make sure never happens. Risk of ruin is a risk that is so big that it financially ruins you, it destroys you. Everything we talk about in real estate and risk is to avoid that outcome. Now, capital risk is not risk of ruin. That's why it's important to distinguish. If your capital risk is risk of ruin, as in the money that you're putting into it, you cannot lose. It will financially ruin you if you lose it. That's too much risk. You shouldn't even be doing it. You need to really reconsider your whole motives, because that's the risk that is acceptable to me. That's the risk that you need to understand this could go south. The rest of the risk we can manage. But capital risk is your known upfront risk that is put in by you and your investors that needs to also be communicated with the investors. This can go away. And please, if you can't lose this money, don't invest in it. One of the big things with capital risk and how you manage that risk is by managing the underlying investment itself. And by investment, I mean your assumptions before you go into it. Make sure you understand the downsides and make sure you have an exit strategy and what that looks like. It's not a subject or a topic you really want to focus on, because as people, we don't like to think if everything goes wrong, right? But it is the one thing you should focus on. A lot of people get caught up in their spreadsheets, thinking that the spreadsheet is reality, thinking that because they adjust numbers in it, that's how it's going to play out. Investment strategies in the real world don't work like that. You need to understand the risk, the limitations, and you need to know how to mitigate that within the asset. How do you increase revenue? How do you control expenses? What's the market doing? All those things that will affect it, and you need to see how you're going to get out of that investment if you need to. That is your capital risk. And that's how you manage that, is really making good decisions, understanding the full nature of your investment, its potential and downside risks. Risk number two, debt. This is a risk that more people focus on and is the greater risk because you owe money that you have to pay. How we avoid this risk is by the type of debt we use. We try to get our assets under contract and we try to move it into a debt that is non-recourse. That means I'm not personally liable. The reason that's important is because I'm trying to avoid the risk of ruin. That's not always available, and it's not always available to me. If I'm doing a development, if we're buying a property and turning it around, until we refinance it, usually I'm liable and on the line. So that comes back to the things like we talked about in capital risk, understanding the nature of the investment, the limitations that it has, upside, downside, where your projections may go wrong, and how you get out of it. This is really important when you're talking about debt. Understanding the contract, what the obligations are on that debt, and making sure that you understand if you're liable for that debt, what happens when things go wrong. The best way to manage this debt is, first of all, to make sure you're in a good contract, but really get it in a non-recourse as long as you can. This is done for commercial real estate. It's done often, and they usually are taking a look at the asset itself as opposed to you. Not usually, they are. They're looking at the viability of that asset. That helps you as well, because you're going through the mental process of understanding how viable the asset is. We love non-recourse debt. Commercial real estate is one of the huge advantages in it. Now, risk number 3, liability. The liability on your property itself. If someone gets hurt, if your investor sues you, all the liability associated with the asset burning, this is normally managed through insurance. But you cannot insure all the risk. That's when contracts come into place. Understanding your contracts with your tenants, your investors, and your third-party associates, right? This may be contracted out people from technology to on-site. Really understanding those contracts and making those contracts be bulletproof is so important. One of the first things we do when we acquire properties, we always put in new contracts because the contracts never satisfy us in the risk scenario. I'm trying to reduce liability by increasing my insurance coverage overall, even things that I'm not thinking about, and at the same token, improving the contracts so they reflect any risk. One of the simple things that we do, even with partners, we put in an arbitrage clause. So if I have a partner and we're not meshing, we need to go to arbitration. We can't end up in lawsuits. You want to avoid, once again, the risk of ruin. And lawsuits can ruin you. So, as a recap, capital risk, the known or assumed risk, putting it in. You limit or manage that risk through education, preparation, and execution. Debt. This is the liability on the property, the payments that need to be made when you purchase it. You put 30% down, a bank comes in and loans you that money. You have to pay that back. You're obligated. You manage that risk by 2 things. First of all, the same thing as capital risk, right? Understanding the investment, making sure you have a good partnership, the contracts on the debt, and if you can, get into non-recourse as quick as possible. That removes you from the equation and removes you from the risk of ruin. There is bad boy clauses as long as you're not doing something fraudulent, which if you are, you owe the debt. Liability from your tenants, your partners, your vendors. This is more of a people liability, but it's also the liability of the asset burning to the ground. We do 2 ways to manage this. Insurance to cover any risks that may be known or unknown. We do large umbrella policies. And then contracts, making sure that your contracts are protecting you from both your tenants, investors, partners, and third parties. Build out those contracts. Make sure that you are not going to run the risk of ruin within that somebody can't take you for all that you're worth. The risk in real estate, it's important to remember you're not getting rid of it. Don't go into the assumption that you can go get rid of risk. If you do that, you're going to be wrong and you're actually going to set up things wrong. It's about managing the inherent risk associated and understanding which risk is tolerable for you and which risks are not. That you say, we don't cross this or I'm not going to do this deal. Understanding your parameters of risk. Our parameters are the risk of ruin. I got to make sure that one deal can't take me out or take out my entire future. I hope that helps. Those are our 3 areas that we focus on. Look at those deals that you're looking at. Like and subscribe. Thanks, everybody.